August 18th, 1944. A narrow road southeast of Falaise, France. Unteroffizier Klaus Becker crouched beside his Flak 18 gun, its long barrel still warm from the morning's firing. For 3 years, he had served this weapon. 3 years of watching Allied bombers fall from the sky, their formations breaking apart under the precise mathematics of his gun crew's calculations. The 88mm had made him feel invincible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Nothing could touch them when they were properly positioned, dug in, protected by camouflage and distance. But today, they were moving. The retreat had begun 2 days earlier. Becker's battery, along with what remained of the 7th Army, was pulling back through a narrowing corridor. The horses stamped nervously in their traces, ears flat against their heads. They could hear it too, the sound that had become the soundtrack of Germany's nightmare in France. The distant rumble of aircraft engines, not the high-altitude drone of heavy bombers, but something worse, something lower, something hunting. His battery commander, Lieutenant Hoffmann, was shouting orders to get the guns moving faster. But there was nowhere to hide on these open roads. No time to unlimber the weapons and set up a firing position. The 88s, the guns that had dominated European battlefields for 5 years, were now just cargo. 2,300 pounds of steel being pulled by exhausted horses along a road that offered no cover, no concealment, and no mercy. Then Becker saw them. 4 dark shapes skimming the treetops to the west. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. The Americans called them Jugs. The Germans had another name for them, Jabos, fighter bombers. And they were coming straight down the road. The story of how the German 88mm gun went from master of the battlefield to vulnerable prey reveals one of World War II's most profound ironies. The weapon that Allied soldiers feared more than any, other that had destroyed thousands of bombers and tens of thousands of ground troops, would meet its match, not in technological superiority, but in tactical evolution. The Germans thought their 88s were safe behind their reputation, their range, and their deadly accuracy. They were wrong. To understand what happened on those roads around Falaise, we must first understand what made the 88mm flak gun such a feared weapon. Its development began in the 1920s, when German engineers, working secretly in Sweden to circumvent Versailles Treaty restrictions, designed an anti-aircraft weapon capable of reaching bombers at altitudes approaching 35,000 feet. By 1936, the Flak 18 entered service. It was unlike anything that had come before. The gun fired a 20-pound high-explosive shell at a muzzle velocity of 840 meters per second. Its effective ceiling reached 26,000 feet, and it could maintain a rate of fire approaching 20 rounds per minute when properly crewed. But what truly set the 88 apart was its versatility. While designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, the Spanish Civil War revealed its devastating effectiveness against ground targets. German crews discovered that the same weapon that could bring down a bomber at 5 miles altitude could penetrate any tank armor at normal combat ranges. Allied bomber crews learned to fear the sight of the 88's distinctive cruciform firing platform. At high altitude, pilots could do nothing except maintain formation and pray that the mathematical calculations of the German fire control systems would place the explosive shells somewhere other than where their aircraft would be seconds later. One American commander remarked that before facing German anti-aircraft fire, air power was thought to mean flying wherever one wished. Afterward, it became clear that the sky belonged to those with the best calculations. American cultural historian Paul Fussell, who had served during the war, would later write that American soldiers knew the greatest single weapon of the war, the atomic bomb excepted, was the German 88mm flat trajectory gun, which brought down thousands of bombers and tens of thousands of soldiers. The Allies had nothing as good. This was the weapon's reputation by 1944: invincible, unstoppable, the master of both air and ground warfare. German gunners painted white victory rings around their gun barrels, marking each kill. Some batteries accumulated dozens of rings, bombers, fighters, tanks, all falling to the 88's precise fire. The weapon had become more than just a piece of equipment. It was a symbol of German technological superiority, a psychological weapon that forced Allied forces to alter their entire approach to warfare. Allied bomber formations had to fly higher, reducing their accuracy by more than half just to survive. Strategic bombing missions became exercises in acceptable loss rates rather than precision strikes. Commanders calculated that flying against targets defended by 488 batteries meant accepting a 12% loss rate per mission. For bomber crews, this meant their odds of surviving a 25-mission tour were little better than even. The 88 didn't just kill aircraft, it killed hope. On the ground, the story was equally grim. Sherman tank crews learned that areas protected by 88mm guns were places where armor could not operate. The German gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards distances at which American tanks couldn't even effectively return fire. Tank after tank rolled into battle only to be destroyed by an enemy they never saw, by shells fired from positions so distant that spotting the muzzle flash was nearly impossible. By 1944, Germany had produced over 21,000 88mm guns in various models. They protected every important industry, communication center, supply point, and bridge across occupied Europe. The weapon had been integrated into tank destroyers like the Nashorn and Jagdpanther. It became the main armament of the Tiger tank, the most feared armored vehicle on any battlefield. German military doctrine had been built around the 88's capabilities, and for good reason. Nothing the Allies fielded could match its combination of range, accuracy, and killing power. But the 88mm gun, for all its fearsome capabilities, had a fundamental vulnerability that German commanders initially failed to recognize. It was a static weapon. Its effectiveness depended on careful positioning, camouflage, and the ability to engage targets at range. The gun weighed nearly 5 tons when limbered for transport. Setting it up required at least 2.5 minutes under ideal conditions, and a crew of 10 men working in coordination. The weapon was designed to fight from prepared positions, not to move under fire. This vulnerability didn't matter much during Germany's years of conquest and occupation. When German forces were advancing or holding prepared defensive lines, the 88s dominated. They could be positioned with care, camouflaged effectively, and supported by infantry and armor. But by August 1944, the situation in France had changed dramatically. The Allied invasion at Normandy on June 6th had established a foothold that German forces couldn't eliminate. American forces under General Omar Bradley had broken through at Saint-Lô on July 25th, launching Operation Cobra. General George Patton's Third Army was racing across France, threatening to encircle the entire German 7th Army. Hitler, against all military logic, had ordered a counterattack toward Mortagne rather than an organized withdrawal. That decision created a pocket around the town of Falaise, and in that pocket, the German army found itself trapped. For the first time in the war, German 88mm batteries were being forced to move constantly, retreating through narrow corridors under relentless pressure. The guns that had dominated from carefully prepared positions were now exposed on open roads. And above those roads, the Allied 9th Air Force had achieved something the Germans had not anticipated: complete air superiority. By late summer 1944, the Luftwaffe over Western France had been reduced to a shadow. German fighter coverage was sporadic at best, non-existent at worst. This meant that Allied fighter bombers could operate with relative impunity, hunting for targets at low altitude, where their effectiveness against ground forces was devastating. The aircraft that would exploit the 88's vulnerability was itself a machine built for punishment. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was the largest single-engine fighter of the war, weighing 7 tons fully loaded. Powered by a massive Pratt & Whitney R2 800 radial engine producing 2,400 horsepower with war emergency power, it could reach speeds of 450 miles per hour. But speed wasn't what made the Thunderbolt effective against ground targets. It was durability and firepower. The P-47 carried 8 50-caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, with 3,400 rounds of ammunition. Late war models could carry 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets and up to 2,500 pounds of bombs. The aircraft's air-cooled radial engine and robust construction meant it could absorb tremendous damage and still bring its pilot home. Pilots who had been shot down in other aircraft learned to love the Thunderbolt's ability to keep flying despite hits that would down any other fighter. Beginning in early 1944, P-47 groups in England transitioned from high-altitude bomber escort missions to low-altitude ground attack work. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang, with its superior range, freed Thunderbolt units for the role they would master close air support and armed reconnaissance. Pilots who had been fighting Messerschmitts at 20,000 feet found themselves diving to treetop level, hunting tanks, trucks, trains, and artillery. The 365th Fighter Group, known as the Hellhawks, exemplified this transformation. Activated in May 1943 and equipped with P-47s, the group arrived in England in December 1943. By February 1944, they were flying combat missions. Initially, they escorted bombers and engaged Luftwaffe fighters. But after D-Day, their primary mission became ground attack in support of advancing Allied armies. The Hellhawks consisted of 3 squadrons, the 386th, 387th, and 388th Fighter Squadrons. The men were young, most barely 20 years old, fresh from flight training in the United States. They lived in tents amid the mud of frontline airfields, their daily routine sharing much in common with the infantry they supported. Unlike bomber crews who returned to comfortable bases in England, the Hellhawks moved forward with the ground forces, operating from hastily prepared strips carved out of French farmland. The pilots learned quickly that ground attack was fundamentally different from air combat. Fighter versus fighter engagements allowed for maneuver, for the exploitation of altitude and speed. Ground attack meant flying low and slow, exposing yourself to every weapon the enemy could bring to bear, from small arms fire to the very 88mm guns you were trying to destroy. The flak came not as distant black puffs, but as streams of glowing tracers that seemed to hang in the air, waiting for your aircraft to fly into them. Lieutenant Leslie Bowes of the 365th Squadron survived being hit by an 88mm shell near Saarbrücken. The projectile shredded his left wing root, fuselage, and flaps. That he made it back to base was testament to the Thunderbolt's construction. By war's end, he had walked away from 4 wrecked fighter bombers, all named Blonde Trouble. His faith in the massive Thunderbolt was unshakable. "This plane deserves greater recognition," he would later say. The Falaise pocket, as it came to be known, represented the culmination of everything the Hellhawks had trained for, and the perfect storm of circumstances that would expose the 88's fatal weakness. By mid-August 1944, approximately 100,000 German troops were trapped in a narrowing corridor between Canadian forces, pushing south from Falaise, and American forces pushing north from Argentan. The only escape routes ran through a handful of small villages and river crossings, all under constant observation by Allied aircraft. German forces attempting to escape the pocket faced an impossible situation. They needed to move during daylight to make any progress, but daylight movement meant exposure to Allied fighter bombers. They needed to keep their heavy weapons, including the precious 88mm guns, but those weapons required vehicles or horses to move them. And by August 1944, Germany's vaunted mechanized army in France had become increasingly dependent on horse-drawn transport. The statistics reveal a truth that contradicts the image of German military efficiency. While propaganda showed gleaming panzers and motorized columns, the reality was that the Wehrmacht relied heavily on horses throughout the war. By 1944, with fuel shortages, crippling mobility, and vehicle losses mounting, this dependence had become critical. Artillery pieces, supply wagons, and even anti-aircraft guns were increasingly pulled by horses rather than trucks or half-tracks. This meant that German 88mm batteries retreating through the Falaise corridor were moving at the speed of exhausted horses, along predictable routes, with no ability to quickly deploy if attacked. The guns that had dominated when stationary became nothing more than cargo when moving. They couldn't shoot back at aircraft while limbered for transport. They couldn't maneuver to avoid attack. They could only keep moving and hope the fighter bombers were hunting elsewhere. On August 18th, 1944, Major George Brooking of the Hellhawks 387th Fighter Squadron was leading his flight on an armed reconnaissance mission southeast of Falaise when he spotted a German column stretching for miles. Trucks, horse-drawn wagons, staff cars, and limbered artillery pieces were creeping along narrow roads, desperate to reach the Seine River and escape, the closing trap. What happened next was described by German Panzer Commander Hans von Luck, who was caught in the chaos. Appalling scenes took place, he would later recall. Enemy planes were swooping down uninterruptedly on anything that moved. I could see the mushroom clouds of exploding bombs, burning vehicles, and the wounded, who were picked up by retreating transports. The P-47s attacked in waves, each flight making multiple passes. Flying at speeds approaching 450 miles per hour, pilots would dive to treetop level, some as low as 35 feet, to strafe columns with their 850 caliber machine guns. The combined firepower of a four-ship flight meant 32 machine guns, each firing at a rate of 800 rounds per minute, could be concentrated on a single target. The effect was devastating. Jack Dentz, then flying with the 386th Fighter Squadron, participated in these attacks. Years later, he would describe the experience to historians Robert Dorr and Thomas Jones for their book Hellhawks. "We went in like flying artillery and just destroyed it all," he told them. "It was hideous. It was the only time I actually came home feeling sick. I killed over 60 horses on just one mission. They had been pulling 88mm guns. Dentz's account reveals the psychological cost of what the pilots were doing. These were not antiseptic engagements against distant targets. The pilots could see everything: the horses screaming and falling in their traces, the gun crews scrambling for cover, the ammunition wagons exploding in chains of secondary detonations. The horses, with their large, wide eyes, had no way to escape. Harnessed as they were to their guns and wagons, they could only die where they stood. The German soldiers who survived these attacks described the experience as nightmarish beyond comprehension. One German corporal wrote that the Jabos were a burden on our souls. They circled constantly overhead, diving on anything that moved, turning the roads into what the Germans themselves called a Jabo-Rennstrecke, a fighter-bomber racetrack. The corridor of death, as some called it, became littered with destroyed vehicles, dead horses, abandoned equipment, and the bodies of soldiers who never reached the Seine. The 88mm guns, so feared when properly employed, were helpless in this environment. Gun crews couldn't set up their weapons fast enough to engage the thunderbolts. The time required to unlimber an 88, extend its outrigger legs, and prepare it for firing a minimum of 2.5 minutes under ideal conditions was an eternity when aircraft were attacking every few minutes. Even if a crew managed to get a gun into firing position, the P-47s were flying too low and too fast for the 88's fire control systems to track effectively. The irony was complete. The weapon designed to shoot down aircraft at ranges of 5 miles was powerless against aircraft at ranges of 50 yards. The gun that could calculate intercept points for bombers flying at 25,000 feet couldn't engage fighters screaming past at treetop level. The 88's own effectiveness at high altitude had prompted Allied pilots to come down to ground level, where the gun's carefully engineered advantages disappeared. The scale of destruction in the Falaise pocket was unprecedented. By the time the gap finally closed on August 21, 1944, the German 7th Army had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Estimates vary, but approximately 10,000 German soldiers died in the pocket, with another 50,000 captured. The material losses were staggering: approximately 350 armoured vehicles, 2,500 trucks and cars, and 250 artillery pieces destroyed or abandoned. Among those artillery pieces were dozens of 88mm guns. Some were destroyed by direct hits from rockets or bombs. Others were abandoned when their horses were killed, and no other means of moving them existed. Still others were captured intact when their crews, recognizing the futility of trying to set up under constant air attack, simply surrendered. The guns that had dominated European battlefields for 5 years became trophies and scrap metal on the roads of Normandy. The Hell Hawks paid their own price for this victory. From D-Day until VE Day, fighter-bomber losses to Flak were substantial. The 9th Tactical Air Command lost approximately 80 aircraft between July 25th and August 7th, 49% to Flak, 24% to small arms fire, 24% to unknown causes, and only 7% to enemy fighters. The Germans still had thousands of anti-aircraft weapons of various calibers, and low-flying fighter bombers had to run a gauntlet of fire on every mission. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lieutenant Edwin Wright of the 404th Fighter Group survived being hit by Flak 6 times during his tour. On one mission, an 8-inch hole was blown in his propeller. If the damage had been 1.5 inches over on either side, the blade would have severed and Wright would have been brought down. His fellow pilots dubbed him Lucky. He ultimately completed 88 missions in P-47 Thunderbolts during the war. For every pilot like Wright who made it home, others were not as fortunate. But the balance had shifted. The weapon that had seemed untouchable, that had forced entire air forces to alter their tactics, had been proven vulnerable. The Germans had designed the 88 for a type of warfare that assumed their forces would hold defensive positions, would have time to properly emplace weapons, would maintain at least some air cover. In the chaos of retreat, surrounded by enemies and under constant air attack, even the fearsome 88 couldn't save them. The destruction of German forces in the Falaise pocket had implications far beyond the immediate tactical victory. It demonstrated a fundamental truth about weapons and warfare, that technological superiority means nothing if the circumstances of battle don't allow that technology to be employed effectively. The 88mm gun remained one of the most powerful weapons of World War II until the final days of the conflict, but never again would it dominate as it had during the years of German conquest. After Falaise, German forces in Western Europe were in continuous retreat. The methodical, prepared defences that had made the 88 so deadly were replaced by improvised positions and hasty withdrawals. Allied air forces, having tasted victory in the killing grounds of Normandy, pressed their advantage relentlessly. Fighter-bomber attacks became standard procedure for any German movement during daylight hours. The jabos that German soldiers had learned to, and fear at Falaise pursued them all the way to the Rhine. The psychological impact on German forces cannot be overstated. Soldiers who had once felt protected by their 88s, who had watched Allied aircraft fall from the sky with regularity, now looked at their own guns with different eyes. Those weapons that had been their shield had become anchors, heavy pieces of equipment that couldn't be moved quickly enough to keep pace with the deteriorating military situation. Gun crews knew that every minute spent on the road, every delay in reaching cover, increased the chances of being caught by Allied aircraft. German commanders struggled with an impossible dilemma. They needed their heavy weapons to defend against Allied armour and to provide some defence against air attack. But moving those weapons in daylight had become tantamount to suicide. Units attempted to move only at night, but this slowed their retreat to a crawl and left them vulnerable to being overtaken by Allied ground forces. Some batteries abandoned their guns rather than risk being caught on the roads. Others tried to fight their way out and were destroyed in place. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided one final demonstration of what happened when the 88 faced Allied fighter bombers. Hitler's surprise offensive through the Ardennes initially succeeded because bad weather grounded Allied aircraft. For several days, German forces advanced under cloud cover that prevented the P-47s from attacking. But when the weather cleared on December 23rd, the fighter bombers returned with a vengeance. Major Robert Motzenbecker of the Hellhawks 387th Fighter Squadron was leading a mission on December 17th when he spotted a German column near Monschau. He had not seen such a tempting target since the German retreat out of the Falaise pocket back in August. His flight attacked immediately, joined by the rest of Hellhawks 365th Fighter Group. By the time the day-long fight near Monschau was over, more than 115 German vehicles and artillery pieces were verified as destroyed, another 65 completely wrecked or damaged, and an unknown number of troops put out of action. The Germans lost two 88mm batteries in that engagement, caught on the road with no time to deploy. The crews had made the same mistake their comrades at Falaise had made, assuming they could move during daylight if they were quick enough. They were wrong. The Thunderbolts found them, attacked them, and destroyed them before they could bring their guns into action. The weapon that could shoot down a bomber at 5 miles altitude was helpless against an attacker at 50 yards. By the time the Allies crossed into Germany itself in early 1945, the 88 was still capable of inflicting terrible casualties when properly employed. The gun's fundamental capabilities hadn't changed. Its shells could still penetrate any Allied tank. Its high explosive rounds could still bring down bombers. But the opportunity to use those capabilities under ideal conditions had largely disappeared. German forces were defending their homeland with inadequate fuel, limited ammunition, and under complete Allied air superiority. The battle statistics from the final months of the war tell the story. From D-Day until VE Day, P-47 Thunderbolt pilots claimed to have destroyed 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armoured fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. While these numbers undoubtedly include overclaiming, common in aerial combat reporting, the scale of destruction was real. German ground forces were being systematically destroyed from the air, and their heaviest weapons, including the 88s, were priority targets. The Luftwaffe's collapse made the situation hopeless. Germany had devoted nearly a quarter of all war-related production to anti-aircraft weaponry, building tens of thousands of guns of various calibers. But without air cover, those guns became isolated targets, rather than an integrated defense network. Fighter bombers could attack flak positions with relative impunity, suppressing some guns while other aircraft struck at ground targets. The system that had been designed to protect German forces had become a liability. Individual acts of courage by German gun crews couldn't change the fundamental reality. There are documented cases of 88 batteries fighting to the last man, their crews serving their guns even as fighter bombers made repeated strafing runs. Some batteries managed to shoot down attacking aircraft, proving that the gun was still deadly when it could be brought to bear. But these were exceptions. Most batteries caught in the open were simply destroyed before they could effectively fight back. The men who flew these missions understood the grim nature of their work. Unlike the romanticized image of fighter pilots engaging in honorable aerial duels, ground attack meant killing men and animals, who often couldn't fight back effectively. It meant seeing the results of your weapons in horrifying detail. It meant flying through walls of flak, knowing that one lucky shot could end your life. The Hellhawks and other fighter-bomber units performed this work with professionalism, but many carried the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Tom Glenn, author of a memoir about P-47 pilots, described one of the saddest duties as strafing columns of horse-drawn guns and equipment. "The horses were not our enemy," Glenn said, "but our assignment was to prevent those columns from harming our troops." This sentiment was echoed by many pilots who participated in ground attack missions. They understood the necessity of what they were doing, but that understanding didn't make the work any easier to live with. For the German gunners who survived the war, the experience of seeing their invincible 88s reduced to helpless targets was equally traumatic. Veterans who had served the guns through the glory years of 1940 and 41, who had painted victory rings around their barrels and taken pride in their technical mastery, had watched those same weapons become death traps. The gun that had made them feel powerful had made them priority targets for enemy aircraft that they couldn't effectively engage. Interviews with German veterans conducted decades after the war reveal the psychological impact of this reversal. Many described the 88 with a mixture of pride and bitterness. Pride in what the weapon had accomplished when conditions allowed it to be used properly. Bitterness at having to abandon guns, at watching horses and comrades die trying to move weapons that had become more liability than asset. The gun that had once symbolized German technological superiority had become a symbol of Germany's defeat. The broader lesson of the 88's vulnerability at Falaise extends beyond World War II. It speaks to the nature of warfare itself, that no weapon system, no matter how technologically advanced or tactically effective under ideal conditions, can dominate if the enemy adapts and finds ways to attack its weaknesses. The Germans had created a gun that could control the airspace up to 35,000 feet. The Allies responded by attacking at 35 feet. This pattern would repeat throughout military history. During the Vietnam War, American forces with overwhelming technological advantages struggled against an enemy that adapted tactics to neutralize those advantages. In more recent conflicts, advanced weapon systems have been defeated by simple improvised explosive devices, or by tactics that exploited vulnerabilities in how those systems were employed. The principle remains constant: every weapon has weaknesses, and a determined enemy will find them. The story of the 88 also illustrates the importance of combined arms warfare and the danger of over-reliance on single weapon systems. German commanders had built their defensive doctrine around the 88's capabilities, assuming that air superiority could be maintained or that ground forces could provide adequate protection for the guns. When those assumptions proved false, the entire system collapsed. Modern military forces still grapple with this challenge: how to create weapon systems that remain effective even when supporting elements are unavailable. The technological legacy of the 88 is equally significant. The gun's effectiveness against armor led directly to the development of dedicated tank destroyers and to the upgunning of tanks themselves. The Soviet 85mm gun, the American 90mm anti-aircraft gun, and numerous post-war weapons traced their lineage to lessons learned from the German 88. Even today, the principle of dual-purpose weapons capable of engaging both air and ground targets owes much to the 88's example. But the tactical legacy is more important. The vulnerability of the 88 when moving taught military planners that even the most powerful weapons need protection during deployment and repositioning. Modern air defense systems are designed with mobility in mind, capable of setting up and tearing down in minutes rather than hours. Self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, mounted on tracked or wheeled chassis, can move and shoot, avoiding the 88's fatal flaw of being helpless while limbered for transport. The relationship between air power and ground forces was fundamentally altered by what happened at Falaise and in the subsequent campaigns across Western Europe. Before these battles, tactical air power was seen as useful but not decisive. After Falaise, it became clear that control of the air could determine the outcome of ground campaigns. This realization shaped military doctrine for decades, leading to the development of dedicated close air support aircraft and the integration of air and ground operations that characterizes modern warfare. The German 88mm gun earned its fearsome reputation honestly. It destroyed thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of ground troops. It forced the Allies to completely rethink their approach to both strategic bombing and armored warfare. For years, it was the weapon that Allied soldiers feared above all others, and with good reason. American historian Paul Fussell wasn't exaggerating when he wrote that soldiers knew the 88 was the greatest single weapon of the war, the atomic bomb excepted. But on the roads around Falaise in August 1944, that reputation couldn't protect the gun crews when they were most vulnerable when they were moving. The men of the Hell Hawks and other fighter-bomber units proved that even the most feared weapon has limitations. They paid a terrible price for that proof. The 19% loss rate to Flak that fighter-bomber unit suffered was higher than the loss rates for bomber crews over Germany. Every mission meant flying low through streams of anti-aircraft fire, accepting casualties as the price of doing business. The destruction they wrought in the Falaise pocket helped break the back of German resistance in France and opened the road to Germany itself. It also demonstrated that in warfare there is no such thing as an invincible weapon. There are only weapons that haven't yet met the tactics designed to defeat them. The 88's vulnerability when moving was always there, inherent in its design. It simply took the right combination of circumstances, the collapse of the Luftwaffe, the development of effective fighter bombers, and the chaos of retreat to expose that weakness. The German soldiers who thought their 88s were untouchable learned otherwise in the most brutal way possible. The Allied pilots who proved them wrong knew that their victory came not from having better weapons, but from finding the one circumstance where their enemy's best weapon couldn't be used effectively. Jack Dentz, the pilot who killed over 60 horses pulling 88mm guns in a single mission, never forgot what he had seen. The memory of those horses, trapped in their traces, unable to escape, haunted him for the rest of his life. That lesson, written in the wreckage of guns and aircraft along the roads of Normandy, remains relevant today. Power is contextual, superiority is temporary, and the weapon you fear the most may be vulnerable in ways you haven't yet discovered. The 88mm gun was, without question, one of the most effective weapons of World War II. But effectiveness under ideal conditions means nothing when those conditions cannot be maintained. In the end, the untouchable gun was touched, the invincible weapon was defeated, and the symbol of German technological superiority became just another piece of abandoned equipment on the roads of a conquered nation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.